Friends, colleagues, students and visitors, welcome to the Melbourne School of Design and welcome to this very special presentation by Rem Koolhaas and David Gianotten. My name is Julie Willis. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning in the Melbourne School of Design here at the University of Melbourne. I begin this evening's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri people's land, and pay respects to their elders and families both past and present. Tonight's lecture is brought about by a collaboration between M Pavilion, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Melbourne School of Design. It is always a pleasure to work with colleagues from across the broader community to bring about engaging and thought-provoking events such as this evening's special presentation. This lecture is streaming online live as I speak, and I'd like to welcome everyone watching us from wherever you may be in the world. We are thrilled to have with us here tonight Rem Koolhaas and David Gianotten of the Netherlands-based Office of Metropolitan Architecture, or OMA as you will know it. Pritzker Prize-winning Rem Koolhaas is the co-founder of OMA and is one of the most celebrated and influential architects working today. David Gianotten is Managing Partner Architect at OMA and is also one of two directors at the recently opened OMA branch office in Australia. Creators of modern architectural icons, OMA is a prolific international practice of worldwide distinction and influence. Their work inspires and astonishes, something we see in our students year on year as they encounter the work of OMA in their studies. Rem and David join us in Australia to celebrate the first ever completed architectural commission by OMA in Australia, the 2017 M Pavilion, installed in Queen Victoria Gardens in the centre of Melbourne's South Bank Arts Precinct. In the first part of this evening's presentation, Rem will talk about his vision of the countryside, a current preoccupation of OMA's, with David Gianotten speaking to an Australian context in the second part of the lecture. Before we begin tonight's talk, I have a few brief notes of thanks. The University and M Pavilion would like to thank the City of Melbourne, the Lord Mayor Robert Doyle and all the City Councillors. The City of Melbourne was the very first to back M Pavilion and has now made an enthusiastic commitment to extend its support through to 2019. The University and M Pavilion would like to thank the City's Chief Planner Rob Adams, who every year plays a key role. The Council shared Naomi Milgram's dream and has added invaluable and enthusiastic support to both the free programming and the relocation of the M Pavilion. We would also like to thank and acknowledge the Embassy of the Netherlands and Australia for their support and partnering in this evening's lecture. Will you please now join me in welcoming Rem Koolhaas and David Gianotten.
Thank you very much. I will start the lecture if the lights are switched off. So can we have the light switch off, please? Really off. Is there? Yeah. Still on. I'm giving this lecture in a kind of really interesting moment for me, because I think after a lot of negotiation and after a lot of collaboration, the Office of Metropolitan Architecture is really a partnership and a partnership without a very explicit or implicit hierarchy. That is a fact is the fact that I'm here because it hasn't been my initiative to open an office in Australia or to begin a campaign in Australia. That is entirely David Gianotten's influence and initiative. So I'm very happy to support it, but it simply is a kind of sign of how we work and that I'm one of the partners, but not necessarily the leader of the office. We are proud of operating as a collective intelligence, and it is important to notice that that doesn't mean that we do not act individually, but in every important element, I think that we are working and sharing information. you probably know that we are not only an architectural office, but that we also have a think tank. And perhaps I should also relativize that. The life in the current world is so complicated that simply being an architectural office is not enough to generate the intelligence that is necessary to explore different conditions, to be intelligent in situations that you don't know, and in general to generate the kind of perception and nuance which is necessary to do intelligent work in different contexts. I was kind of supposed to talk about our current preoccupation with the countryside, but I thought it was actually kind of more interesting if we give a kind of cross-section through what we're doing at any one time, because those of you who are architects or will be architects, it's important to realize that in architecture you never pursue only one thing or deal with only one subject. It is in essence a kind of simultaneous, almost simultaneous magic where you kind of deal with issues that are of critical importance, issues that are purely financial, issues that are purely artistic, issues that are supposedly unimportant, issues that are frivolous. And I wanted to give a kind of sense of that range, because I think the range in itself is an important driver of what we do. So, without further ado, I want to give you this kind of context, and I will show kind of things that are currently projects that I'm kind of working on, but also collaborations. So, we or I, and in that sense, you know, I hate talking about I, but in cases where it's relevant, I will do it this evening. So I'm kind of working on a project for display, a very modest project for the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And here you see the kind of carriers, and here what they will eventually do to accommodate the selected art. I'm also dealing with interior design. This is a tower, a museum tower, which is part of the Carapata Foundation in Milan. When it opened, only this part was ready, but systematically over the last 2 years, this tower, which is for the collection of Miuccia Prada and Patrizia Bertelli, is finishing. And part of the tower will be a restaurant. You can perhaps see that this is a kind of strange tower. What we did is that every next floor is 1 meter taller than the other. So it is squeezed, and what we did it deliberately so that every work of art is able to be hung in very different conditions. This row is interrupted here by a restaurant. So as part of interior design, I'm kind of simply considering whether that kind of restaurant should have a kind of typical Italian kind of facade, or whether it should be a kind of reference to more kind of metropolitan, classical metropolitan environment. So I'm deliberately doing this to give you a kind of sense that that we also do, or I also do, kind of really regular and normal things. Here, and this is a kind of really important preoccupation of us, of the recent period. 6 years ago, we became interested in kind of preservation. The reason we became interested in preservation is that I felt architects were increasingly pushed at a kind of formalist extravagance. Almost everywhere we operated, there was an expectation, if not an obligation, to create icons. And by taking the issue of preservation seriously, it seemed that we could escape from that obligation. And that explains a number of kind of projects we recently have been doing. This is a kind of renovation of the Tretyakov Museum in Moscow, a building dating from the Soviet period, that for most of you, its architectural qualities will be kind of invisible. But it happens to be located in an amazing place, an amazing context. For instance, this is the, sorry. This is the Kremlin. This is the cathedral that was kind of recently built. This is the river that intersects Moscow. And here you have a kind of fantastic urban park, Gorky Park, which is now becoming a kind of cultural lung of the city. And this building is an enormous length of typical modernist architecture in the heart of the city. Its qualities are maybe invisible to the contemporary kind of architectural consumer. But one thing you can kind of see is that, like any building that was generated in the time of communism, it has abundant and generous pedestrian and interior spaces. If you look at the narrowness of a lot of the kind of current, the compactness and kind of oppressiveness of current spaces, the spaces generated under communism, even if they are less than 35 years old, have a kind of impressive, almost luxury, even though they're very Spartan, of these over-dimensioned conditions. But there is a kind of problem with this building, which is that kind of basically every experience and every kind of space is separated from any other one. So what we hope to be able to do is to work with this building, but to eliminate kind of some of the barriers and therefore make more accessible what the quality of this architecture is, and therefore may reveal the generosity inherent in this communist work. What we're also going to do is to look at the kind of storage of the building, and this is an explicit demand also of the leadership of the building, so that of the museum, so that we can make the content of the museum, the content of the collection, which in many parts is almost independent of artistic merit, but simply a collection of artworks that were produced in Soviet Union and its colonies, to make that kind of more accessible to the people. So here we have one of the paintings that will become accessible, which is kind of probably in Australia not a kind of very hot issue, but under communism was, namely kind of women working on prefabricated architecture with great enthusiasm and presumably refinement. So this is another kind of effort that we're doing. And I hope that you kind of realize that we are kind of moving kind of from our core base, kind of Europe, slowly we are making our way to the east. And that is not a coincidence, because I firmly believe that in spite of globalization, the potential and possibilities in each culture and in each part of the world differ drastically. And that therefore it is no longer kind of possible to kind of think of architecture as a kind of single system. Each architecture is an encounter between a local situation, its potential, and the talent or interest of the architects. I'm now in the Middle East. In Doha, we had to work on a library for a university, which eventually became the National Library, and where the explicit mandate was to make a building that encourages the population at large to read. And therefore, it was very important for us to eliminate all the kind of hostility that the typical library has. It is divided in floors, it is divided in incomprehensible departments such as humanities, blah, blah, blah. So what we did instead, we took an almost urban plane. We folded the kind of urban plane so that you could kind of enter from beneath one of these kind of folded entities, and so that you kind of entered the building in the center, and that you were surrounded by books in such a way that if you entered here, in one glance you could see any book that was kind of present in this library, and therefore without the interference of catalogs or divisions, you were confronted with the essence of this kind of situation. This is the kind of rendering. And what I think is a kind of not enough kind of recognized part of architecture is that, of course, you make a plan, and of course you're trying to be as precise as possible, but then another layer or another kind of series of influences start. A very important one is the contractor. This was a kind of building done by an Australian contractor. So although I have not been in Australia for 40 years, I've had a deep engagement and confrontation with the kind of Australian culture in Doha. But that kind of in this situation, it's like a kind of fog of war. Everyone knows that kind of building is quite complicated. There is a lot of contested territory and initiative. And in this fog of war, you have to take certain decisions that have a fundamental influence on the kind of result, but that are, for which you almost don't have the time to work. One of the kind of decisions we took here is that originally we had a ceiling of white concrete that didn't kind of reflect, and at the last moment we thought that perhaps we should make a kind of reflective ceiling so that not only the floor plate was kind of reflected in the ceiling, so that you were surrounded in a really kind of interesting situation. And here you see the effect of that kind of reflexivity, the real thing, and then a kind of virtual kind of building upside down that covers the original ground. So maybe a kind of decision taken in 5 minutes, but with a kind of vast and considerable effect on the reality of the building. I'm now moving from I to we. This is a building I've been working on from the beginning with David Gianotten. It's a kind of building in Taipei. Taipei is a kind of really wonderfully alive Asian culture. And part of that is expressed in a kind of incredibly intense nightlife. Statistically, Taipei is the population that sleeps least and goes to bed latest. And almost anywhere kind of in the city there is a kind of crest of intense urban activity. Here you see a kind of a form of efficiency that actually inspired to a large extent the kind of nature of the building. In the typical kind of cultural center, you would see a kind of auditorium with a kind of big stage, a second auditorium with a smaller stage, and then a kind of third auditorium. And basically all of these are kind of separated so that there is no communication and no additional value of the existence of each of these elements together. What we decided to do, and it was kind of really directly influenced by this pan that cooks 3 different dishes, we decided to condense all the stages in a kind of single hyper stage tower, so that all the kind of mechanical features of the building are concentrated and are able to collaborate kind of between themselves, and then to suspend the auditoriums or the kind of parts for the audiences away from this kind of central feature. This is also kind of going into a direction about which I will kind of talk later. I have a kind of instinct that the 21st century will be a kind of century where we can no longer assume that that everything an architect does is actually for human clients, but that kind of more and more we will have to accommodate not only the existence of human beings and their interaction, but also the existence of machines and their interaction with human beings, and in certain cases only the kind of relationship between machines. So here I could say this is a kind of pre-configuration or premonition of that kind of architecture. The building is largely, I would say, a theoretical machine in which there are kind of pockets for human beings. Here you see the kind of situation, the hyper stage tower with the kind of remnants of humanism in the form of the 3 auditoriums. The advantage or the feature that this combination can really enables us to do is to treat each theater as an independent entity, but also to combine them into a kind of single auditorium that could kind of combine 4,000 people, and that would enable you to create theatrical spectacles almost on an industrial scale. It's very noticeable that kind of artists prefer to work in industrial complexes because they don't like the limits that architecture and architects impose. And here there is a kind of effort to mobilize that scale to extend the kind of possibility of theater makers. In that sense, I would say also that one of the essences of our office is not a kind of compulsion to be controversial, but to kind of rethink every single component and see how it can feature and perform in more ways than one, and in certain cases in more ways than the original client has anticipated. So here you see the kind of thing in its urban context, and as a kind of special feature, it's not only a theater for the visitors, but it is also a theater where the population at large can enter free and kind of move through the entire building as it performs to appropriate it kind of independent of money. Here, again, you see kind of some of the fog of war images. The building is nearing completion, but nearing completion is a kind of very euphemistic terms for a kind of war zone. And here you see kind of an image of that war zone. So this theater is nearing completion, but it could also be a kind of picture after a natural disaster. Here you see the kind of, the theaters of course have different typologies. A classical theater kind of black box, and in this case is a more theater as it used to be with kind of galleries, balconies and loges. And you begin to see kind of some of the aesthetic, and here you see the intention of this kind of coupling and how that is elaborating or evolving into a kind of really enormous interior scale, almost industrial scale, or a machine scale as the kind of essence of the building as a whole. So here again, as you've kind of probably seen in every building, there is a kind of strong intention to relate the building to a very specific and unique context. That is part of our so-called research, an insatiable interest, curiosity and energy in terms of understanding the capacity, the potentials, the values, the interests of the vast range and spectrum of cultures in which we have the privilege to intervene. And in this particular case, I would say our interest was and is to become part of that culture. I already kind of explained how we are not only an architectural office, but that we have this kind of counterpart AMO, and that kind of deals with all these kind of different domains. But also by dealing with these domains, of course, we have a network that kind of extends way beyond the typical architectural office. And I will therefore, as part of that effort to create knowledge almost independent of what we can do as architects, share with you kind of some of the kind of the reason we're interested in the countryside and some of our kind of preliminary intuitions and results. Basically, this is a kind of tourism that kind of more than half of mankind now lives in urban conditions. It's a kind of very complex kind of subject because it means that one person's urban condition, for instance Denmark or Australia, is very different from an urban condition such as New York or Amsterdam. But anyway, let's accept the cliche, But unfortunately, the cliché has given rise to an almost exclusive focus on cities, on urbanity, on kind of ratings between city, and it has led almost systematically to a neglect of whether you call it countryside or country. Let's simply speak about everything that is not city. In spite of that enormous attention, I think a crucial development has escaped attention, and that is that the nature of the city, kind of largely through the fact that the market economy has become the kind of global driver of urban development, rather than ideology or rather than kind of political intention, has actually drastically changed the nature of cities. And not only, I would say, the nature of cities, but also the nature of our civilization. And I would say that the most important kind of thing the market economy has imposed on all of us, whether we know it or not, or are kind of unhappy about it or not, is a global aversion of risk. And I would say that in this picture you see it very clearly. This is a person seen from behind. It's night, and you know that kind of basically in the coming hours he will probably experience an adventurous situation. It is not clear whether his activities will be legitimate or illegitimate. You really kind of realize that almost everything is possible. And I would say that the kind of condition where everything is possible has become a kind of very rare condition. This is the typical man of today. It's daylight, and you see him entering a landscape of enforced innocence. He has a suitcase with him, but the most evil thing you can imagine in that suitcase is a change of underwear. This is a kind of person who is sure not to undergo something either drastic, illegitimate, or dangerous. So for me, the difference between this and this is kind of really also, if you kind of project it on the scale of the city, what has actually happened in our kind of recent past. And this is true in almost every domain. This is an artist in 1980 in New York. He is clearly making an incredibly aggressive gesture. He just cut a public space in two parts. The wall kind of interferes with the kind of patterns of the pedestrian. It's basically a hostile thing, and he's very proud of it. And basically, we were totally used to considering that kind of artistic gesture as a legitimate gesture. Here we are now kind of 30 years later, we see that art has become like a pet, a very nice and cute object in which we are reflected, so it's kind of part of ourselves, and we can take selfies of it in almost unlimited amount. Nobody made selfies with this one, and everyone takes selfies with that one. Yeah, yes, you laugh, but I think it's kind of part of a kind of really kind of very serious kind of problem. Our addiction to appealing things. And I would say that unbeknown to us or on our own watch, the kind of values of the revolution or of the Enlightenment, freedom, equality and brotherhood are kind of systematically replaced by comfort, security and sustainability. Now, neither one of these qualities is in themselves bad. I partly endorse them. It's just unfortunate that these are our ultimate preoccupations. And if they become that, I would say we're in a kind of quite difficult and almost dangerous kind of situation in itself. And I think what I became kind of aware of is that our concentration on the city, the terminology that we are developing for kind of urban life, and the kind of shift through the market economy toward these three values are part and parcel of the kind of same issue, and that therefore it becomes important to look at the countryside, to look at what the effect of the market economy has been on the countryside, and then simply to explore new conditions. One underlying effect of that is that the cities are now places of cuteness, and maybe that cuteness is kind of generated at the expense of the city or at the expense of the countryside, or only by organizing the countryside in a kind of highly structured manner. And so the whimsicality of our urban life is maybe kind of bought by a high organization of the countryside. So if you look at the countryside, what do you see? Only 2% of the surface of the earth is city. So for that reason alone, we ought to look at the countryside because it's 89%. The countryside is, of course, if you also include the sea, where global warming will have its most drastic effect. The countryside, together with the city, is increasingly defined by a kind of invisible regime of preservation. It's not only in new cities that we need to preserve, but also in the countryside that more and more kind of reserves are declared. We calculated that the overall surface of the world, including the seas, 12% is now protected. That means that kind of basically the world is in a kind of strange imbalance. Part of it are protected, so they are declared stagnant, they cannot kind of change, but the rest is going through a kind of turmoil of perpetual change. So what countryside is basically a kind of series of case histories distributed over the world that are each time looking at unique situations, but that in their mosaic coherence say something in general about the countryside. I want to quickly take you through a few of those areas. The countryside has been the kind of par excellence a canvas for dictators to imagine their own utopias, from kind of Hitler's reconfiguration of the kind of European countryside to Mao's reconfiguration of the kind of Chinese countryside and Stalin's kind of redesign literally of the course of rivers. The countryside is a projection screen for dictatorial and authoritarian imagination, but also of political imagination, kind of democracies. This is kind of the redesign of Europe that was kind of a consequence of the European market. And if you look at the European countryside, before it was like this, and after the EU, it is now increasingly like this. So it's not only dictators who kind of work, but it's, and this is obviously all in the name of having to restructure the countryside, organize it better, so that our urban kind of culture can thrive. If you look at the country kind of Russia, then, and if you look under communism in 87, this was the network of Aeroflot. It kind of had over thousands of destinations. So you could say globally that kind of every part of Russia was connected by air to any other part. Now, under the market economy, that number of destinations has drastically shrunken. So what it means is that our, let's say, great libertarian, liberal kind of system has marooned a large part of Russia and kind of condemned them to kind of return to the 19th century or even the kind of 18th century. Maybe, and you would typically think that is a disaster. And we went to look at, what that part of condemned kind of Russia, and then discovered that kind of the very fact of not being able to partake in the current evolution of the world also has its benefits, and also creates a kind of incentive for great imagination in terms of how to survive. But it's very much more complicated than that, because exactly that part of Russia is also where permafrost is, through global warming, beginning to melt, and therefore literally the kind of foundations of that part are melting. So it's a kind of situation which is not only in time traveling backwards, but also literally in meltdown. So that is a kind of very important thing or picture to understand, which is kind of clearly totally invisible on our current kind of urban radar. If we look at Africa, and this is just a kind of very short example, we saw in the 60s a number of mostly female, but this is a kind of footnote, scientists observing populations of monkeys, gorillas, and chimpanzees, and making kind of very stunning discoveries in terms of their behavior. 30 years later, we are in this situation that kind of the observation of gorillas has become a kind of tourist industry, of course also the kind of market economy, and we see a kind of overwhelming kind of presence of human beings interfering with the life of the gorilla, again in the countryside. Typically, we would say that is kind of bad and kind of really sad, and we are looking now at the kind of shrinking natural habitat, and all the actions that NGOs and governments are kind of imagining to deal with that shrinkage. One important way in which they do that is to introduce buffer zones, so that kind of the two are kind of separated. But what they didn't anticipate is that the buffer zones are now the preferred habitat of the kind of monkeys, because for them it's nicer to live in a buffer zone and to encounter the human beings at a kind of regular base than to be in a real jungle with all its life and death kind of threats and issues. So again, what is very noticeable in the countryside is that less and less of our typical moral impulses and kind of alternatives are viable there. Of course, we live in the digital age, and the digital age is kind of perhaps having a larger effect on the countryside than on our cities, and that is because the ubiquity of observation and the increasing sophistication of observation, where the kind of resolution of the kind of digital picture that satellites produce and the analytical value of that picture is increasing. The sharpness of that picture is increasing kind of almost daily. That means that kind of, for instance, agriculture has become increasingly, or is becoming increasingly kind of a digital field, literally to the sense that kind of every kind of square inch of the world is now knowable, but not only from the outside as a kind of picture, but also can be analyzed what grows, what is needed, what is the problem, etc. That knowledge is kind of basically transmitted to laptops, and from the laptops to computerized or automated tractors that are becoming increasingly kind of robotic entities that execute the observation of the satellite kind of through the medium of the laptop and translate that in urban or in a rural life. The machinery to do that is getting so sophisticated that it can no longer be kind of owned by individual farmers. It's also so expensive that it can only be viable if the activity of harvesting and seeding becomes a 24-hour activity. So here you see, and this is maybe another fog of war image, the incredible intensity where this process kind of do through digitalization, and the amazing effect of simply erasing features that is the direct consequence of this. So now I talked about kind of simply the effect of the digital agriculture on agriculture, largely in America so far. I will also talk about this is a picture of Nevada. This is Lake Tahoe. Silicon Valley is kind of to the lower left of the picture. Nevada has a kind of different tax system than California, and therefore it is cheaper to establish the infrastructure of Silicon Valley in Nevada, supposedly nothingness of Nevada, kind of rather than in expensive California. So we have, this is the kind of city of Reno, known for in the 50s divorce and a casino city. On the other hand, there is a kind of Lake Tahoe Reno Industrial District, an area of business kind of establishments bigger than the city itself, in which we see a kind of proliferation of kind of big boxes, each dedicated to different, so far again, American companies established in this territory. Basically, you see there's a kind of enormous scale of these kind of buildings that again is escalating every day, where the longest buildings are clearly on their way to kind of maybe 2 or 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer footprints. Colossal scales, almost unimaginable before. The interesting thing is that if you look at this map, which kind of shows flatness and curvature or flatness and relief in the kind of world, because of this kind of explosion of scale, flatness in itself is becoming a kind of more and more important feature in the attractiveness or not of different territories and countries. I am proud to talk about the flattest country, in the name of the flattest country in the world, but unfortunately it's almost full. But anyway, it used to be that kind of settlements were on the encounter of land and sea. I think that settlements increasingly will gravitate toward areas of flatness. And if flatness is not natural, it will be kind of fabricated, such as this one, simply by, again, erasing all the kind of features. And I think that this erasing features is perhaps one of the key qualities of the 21st century, and in my view also of the kind of digital. Here we have the kind of preparation for what will be the largest kind of factory in the history of mankind, Tesla battery factory in Reno, already one of the biggest buildings, but this is only a small part of its eventual scale. And I was already announcing that, in my view, we are kind of seeing a kind of really important point in the kind of history of architecture, which is what is the relationship between the architecture and the human being. We still operate as if we are kind of working in the name of humans, as if we are kind of promoting human interaction. But actually, what we need to kind of face, and for which we have to find perhaps a new language, is a totally different kind of system, where the human being is not some kind of benevolent person in search of encounters and interaction, but on the contrary, kind of grim supervisor of process. And in that grimness, kind of also himself suspected as an inhabitant of these complexes, because human beings might kind of disturb the kind of perfection that the machines require. This is kind of a transition of one part of a factory, not Tesla, into another factory. And architecture is kind of reduced to kind of chambers for human beings that, like this one, kind of mixed of Cambodian, Norwegian, and some kind of hippie sense, which will be kind of probably the last of typically architectural space. But I think what we're also seeing, and this is why I'm kind of fascinated in the countryside, and where I think we need to embrace, or we need to brace for, but also embrace new opportunities that this shift would give. One of them is that kind of because of our obsession with comfort, we have been kind of increasingly looking for, avoiding kind of extreme emotions, extreme aesthetics, we have become addicted to beige. Here, there is no reason for beige. We can kind of really re-embrace contrast or harsh oppositions or extreme conditions, and such as this one, which is a kind of greenhouse in the Netherlands, where only part of the spectrum, that part which promotes growth of plants, is kind of mobilized. Totally new conditions of the sublime, in which we as human beings are almost redundant. David?
So, after this introduction of the research around the countryside, I can do a very first exploration of an Australian desert. And I'm going to try to put this a little bit in perspective, because you probably saw the map that Rem showed, and there is no Australia on that in the region of exploration, until, of course, we were asked to do it and look at it. So what I'm going to show is a very first look, and I will try to put that in the perspective of my lecture from this summer that was actually looking at the city, and now I will try to look at the countryside. Obviously, this is what most of us know about Australian cities, beautiful pictures with amazing rankings. In the summer I said 6 years. Today I can say 7 years, because in that transition there was another year added. But there is no urban design and architecture, and there's also no economic performance in that criteria. It's purely based on, and as Rem already said, risk-adverse things as safety, sanitation, and social dynamism is not there. But if you look at the city itself, and this is the other picture of what Melbourne actually is, and then you have a total different perspective. And here you see already that the blur between the city and the country around it, let's call it that, here in Australia, becomes very blur in an enormous, vast territory that is somewhere in between. So are these rankings actually representative, and can they actually be used for public policy, or policy on how to develop a city, or how the city relates to the countryside or the country? In the summer I compared things between Australia and the Netherlands just because, of course, that's very familiar terrain for us, and if you want to do a first exploration referring back to something that you know very well makes it much easier. At that point I was talking about transport and dependency on transport, which becomes increasingly more important in cities and in movement of people. And I will just simply continue this comparison between Australia and the Netherlands in that first exploration a little bit. So that comparison needs a perspective. Your country is about 185 times bigger than our country, and that's of course an enormous difference. Yet, if you look at the inhabitants of the countries, that is not about 185 times. Actually, it is only about 1.5 times. So the vastness of your country is enormous. You have about 300,000 square meters per person. We have to do it with 2,400. And if you look at the population densities, maybe they are very similar at very small spots, but in the biggest part of your country, that is not the case. And as Rem already said, unfortunately, our end is full. And that is not only in the city part, as you can see, that is also in the countryside the case. If you look at our footprints, they are very comparable. So the footprint of Australia and the Netherlands are, so somewhere we need about, if we would keep living like we do, you need about 4.5 Earths to sustain, and we need about 3.5. Which is actually similar. That means we are actually very well off altogether and have way too much money. There's another interesting comparison that is related to the countryside, and that's like about 50% of our land, and then I talk percentage-wise, is related to agriculture or something that is related to agriculture. And that's actually extremely similar. Although the scale of the countries are very different, you see the agriculture percentage is pretty similar. Of course, everybody thinks that this is the Netherlands and this is our countryside. You have to search for this nowadays. Actually, there are only 2 or 3 preserved spots in the whole country that still look like this, and that's where the tourists go. So this is the cliché of the Dutch countryside. There's already no cow anymore. We should have added that, but that was the situation. If you look at kind of what the country really is, you see that most of it is a kind of systematic divide of emphasis and where things need to happen just to maintain that society that is so dense and clear. And this is the reality, and especially if you look at the countryside, it's a vast array of glass where things grow, and they grow also in a very technical environment. There are other vast areas that need to kind of conquer our, let's say, urge, but also need for energy and everything that is related to it, and make it more sustainable, as Rem already said. That can, of course, not happen in our cities alone. What we need is also in the outside. And then also part of that reality is simply that countryside in our country is already way too small to fulfill this 3.5 Earths that we need. So we're also occupying every little hole in the city with similar technologies. And therefore our fish don't come out of the sea in the Netherlands anymore, but they are kind of red on top of your office building. And then you can eat them in the canteen. That's of course an unbelievable efficient system. Also kind of means that there's a lot of knowledge acquired, and we're very proud to transport that all over the world. But of course, that means our economy is only increasing, which means our footprint will increase significantly. Now, then we compare it to Australia in a first exploration. This is the cliché, or at least outside of the country, that's the cliché for your countryside or country. But then if you look at the similar way as in the Netherlands, you can also divide Australia into very clear territories with very clear functionalities that need to perform in a certain way. Of course, you're here on the knowledge and finance side. I already said we have way too much together, but the big part of your country is about very different things and actually supplying out of the countryside, let's say, the livability of a big part of the eastern side of the world. So is the question here, is the cliché maybe also the reality in contradiction to what I showed about the Netherlands? Of course, there is this very romantic idea of the outback or your country, but what you see is that it also increasingly starts to generate technology. An interesting part, when you look simply at kind of this is farms, you see that the farms tend to kind of also look at your cities or be around your cities. So is maybe urbanity and countryside here closely related, and big parts of the country are ignored? Because in defining the outback, there is kind of a vast area that is still available for maybe that switch. Rem said it already, flatness becomes more and more important. And it's very interesting for us, kind of we invented our own country, so we're very flat and below sea level. But if you think about Australia, you maybe not think about vast areas of flatness other than the desert. But if you look at the world map, you can see that the areas that are unused and are flat are pretty scarce, and Australia actually has an enormous amount of them. If you zoom in, that is this amount of area over the country. That's more than 50% of it. Then climate, of course, also is a very important point. There we are totally not comparable. Maybe Melbourne and its surroundings is a little bit comparable on the high-end side of the Netherlands, but the rest is totally not. And there is, of course, especially in the outside world, the idea that your climate is changing so rapidly and it's very harsh. But that's not a reality. That was maybe in the 80s and 90s a little bit on that ozone discussion, but that is kind of just completely not there anymore. If you zoom in, actually the areas of climate change, and that is kind of portrayed here on this world map, go in total different directions, and actually in areas where you would not expect them from a climate perspective. If you zoom in to Australia, actually large parts of your country are not so much affected by climate change, and actually some are kind of becoming better accessible than where they were before. And then what for me was a very interesting thing when we did this first exploration research, when we looked at clean air. Of course, a very hot topic in big parts of the world. And if you kind of look at the areas that have clean air, you see also here that your country is actually extremely well off. There is a lot of clean air available, even in areas where density occurs. If you overlay these three things, you can maybe imagine what the possibilities could be in Australia. And the first explorations of these ideas are also getting there. There's a huge farm that is completely self-sustainable and creates an unbelievable amount of tomatoes. We are pretty happy and or jealous on it. And if you see that here, it's completely maintained in its own world. You see how flat it is and kind of how much space there is still around it. Another thing, I already said it, energy is of course an important thing. If we keep depending on kind of coal and that kind of stuff, which of course for your mining industry is very interesting, but for the idea of where you're moving towards, it's not. You can also see that kind of your outback or country can really be used for amounts of energy demand. And again, this is a very first exploration about things that are already happening, but just on a scale that can be done maybe 185 times. And even here in Victoria, you start seeing this use of the country or countryside for the catering of the use of the city. This is a kind of a first observation, as I already said. Obviously, we would love to explore this further, and with the M Pavilion, we also agreed that we start looking at country not through our eyes, not based on our explorations, but actually by people here in Australia trying to add to these first explorations. And we obviously hope to do that with also the M Pavilion. I will want to close with that because also it was started like that why we're here. We had our first event this afternoon in it. It was relatively crowded, not as crowded as here, but of course the space is also much smaller. But we hope that the engagement of the pavilion, the debate, can really steer also kind of more of these explorations in the coming months for the city and for the country. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock there's the next event, and I hope that you will also come in these big numbers then, so that we can keep exploring together. This was my little dessert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rem and David. It's been an absolutely fascinating insight into some of the work that the firm has been doing, but also some of the ways you are thinking about things as you go forward. Thank you also to the M Pavilion and the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands for making tonight's special presentation possible. Thank you all for attending this evening and for those who have tuned in to our live stream. Let's give our guests another warm round of applause.